The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as Mr. Thompson walked home from Carter's grocery, his reusable shopping bags filled with ingredients for his famous chili. As a high school counselor, he always made extra portions to share with students who might not have enough to eat at home. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street. He'd taken this route hundreds of times before, always enjoying the peaceful walk through his neighborhood. The familiar sights and sounds brought him comfort after long days spent helping troubled teens navigate their challenges. Today, though, something felt different. The air seemed heavier, charged with an energy he couldn't quite explain. As he passed by the community center parking lot, a white delivery van caught his eye. At first glance, it seemed ordinary enough, the kind you'd see making everyday deliveries. But something about it made him pause. Maybe it was his years of working with kids in crisis, or maybe it was just instinct, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That's when he heard it, a sound so faint, he almost missed it over the rustle of leaves and distant traffic. A muffled cry, like someone trying to speak through a thick cloth. His heart began to race, but his mind remained clear. Other people walked past, heads down, absorbed in their phones or lost in thought about dinner plans and evening routines. But Mr. Thompson knew he couldn't just walk away. 20 years of counseling had taught him to trust his gut. He'd seen too many cases where people looked the other way, telling themselves it wasn't their business or that someone else would handle it. He'd sat with too many kids who said no one noticed when they needed help. He'd promised himself long ago that he would never be that person who just walked by. Setting his grocery bags down behind a nearby bush, he pulled out his phone and started recording, just in case. The weight of his decision pressed on his shoulders as he approached the van, trying to appear casual while staying alert. His palms were sweating now, but his steps remained steady. He couldn't help thinking about his own son at home, probably working on his science project, waiting for Dad to come back with ingredients for dinner. The van's windows were tinted, but condensation had built up inside, creating small patches where he could almost see through. As he moved closer, pretending to check his phone, he noticed movement inside. Then he saw it, a small hand pressed against the window, leaving a clear print in the condensation. The sight made his blood run cold. For the past 2 days, the local news had been running stories about a missing boy from the neighborhood. Mr. Thompson had seen the parents on TV, their faces drawn with worry, begging anyone with information to come forward. The missing child posters were still fresh on telephone poles and store windows. A young Asian boy with a bright smile and a Pokemon backpack. Standing there in the growing darkness, Mr. Thompson faced a choice that would change multiple lives forever. He could walk away and call the police, hoping they would arrive in time. Or he could stay, knowing that his presence might put him in danger, but could prevent the van from leaving with its precious cargo. More muffled sounds came from inside the van, and his decision crystallized. As a counselor, he'd always taught his students that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about doing what's right even when you're scared. Now it was his turn to live by those words. Keeping his phone recording, he took a deep breath and reminded himself of all the self-defense classes he'd taken at the community center. His hands were shaking slightly as he pulled out his phone to dial 911, but his voice was steady. He knew that what happened in the next few minutes would matter more than anything else he'd done in his life. What he didn't know was that this moment would set in motion a chain of events that would uncover something far bigger and more dangerous than he could have imagined. With his phone gripped tightly in his hand, Mr. Thompson circled the van slowly, his heart pounding against his chest. The parking lot had emptied out now, leaving him alone with his rising fears and that mysterious white van. The evening air had grown colder, but he barely noticed the chill. Every few seconds, he glanced around, watching for anyone who might approach. Through gaps in the condensation, he could make out more movement inside. That's when he saw the boy's face clearly for the first time, eyes wide with fear, pressing against the window just like in the missing child posters. The child looked exhausted and frightened, but alive. Relief flooded through Mr. Thompson, quickly followed by a surge of protective anger. He kept his phone recording, documenting everything while trying to stay calm. His hands were steady now, driven by a sense of purpose that overcame his fear. The boy inside seemed to realize someone had noticed him. Their eyes met through the glass, and Mr. Thompson gave a small, reassuring nod. He needed the child to know help had arrived, but he also didn't want to attract attention by making any big movements. The van's interior was dark, but he could see enough to spot a wooden panel separating the front seats from the back. Delivery vans didn't usually have that kind of setup. Something about it reminded him of the safety workshops he ran at school, where they talked about suspicious vehicles and stranger danger. Now those lessons felt painfully real. The local news had mentioned that the missing boy, a bright 10-year-old who loved science and video games, had disappeared while walking home from the library. His parents had been searching nonstop, their faces on every local channel, begging for their son's return. Mr. Thompson thought of them now, probably sitting by their phone, hoping for any news about their child. Keeping one eye on his surroundings, he spoke quietly into his phone, describing everything he saw. The van's license plate, the small dent in the rear bumper, the faded logo of what looked like a cleaning company on the side. Details that might help police identify the vehicle later. His years of counseling had taught him the importance of staying focused and gathering information, even in frightening situations. As he moved around to the driver's side, he noticed something that made his skin crawl. There were scratch marks near the door handle, as if someone had tried to force their way out. The sight made his stomach turn, but he forced himself to keep recording. He thought about his own son again, safe at home, and how easily it could have been him in that van. The 911 operator was asking him questions now, her voice calm and professional in his ear. Yes, he was sure about what he was seeing. No, he hadn't approached the van directly. Yes, he could stay on the line. Police were already on their way, she assured him. But would they arrive in time? The sun had almost set, and the parking lot was growing darker by the minute. That's when he heard it, the sound of footsteps approaching from behind the building. His muscles tensed as he quickly moved to the other side of the van, trying to stay out of sight while keeping the vehicle in view. The footsteps grew closer, and he could hear keys jingling. Someone was coming back to the van. In those few seconds, Mr. Thompson made a decision that would test every ounce of his courage. He couldn't let the van drive away, not with that child inside. The operator was telling him to keep his distance, to wait for the police, but he knew in his heart that waiting wasn't an option. He had promised himself long ago that he would never stand by while a child was in danger. As the footsteps rounded the corner, Mr. Thompson stepped out from behind the van, planting his feet firmly on the asphalt. His phone was still recording, his free hand raised to show he wasn't a threat. But his stance made it clear. This van wasn't going anywhere. Whatever happened next would change lives forever, including his own. Time seemed to slow down as Mr. Thompson stood his ground in front of the van. His phone was still recording, capturing what happened next. The person approaching was a tall man wearing a delivery uniform, looking completely ordinary at first glance. That's what made it even more chilling. How normal everything appeared on the surface. "There's a problem with your van," Mr. Thompson said firmly, his voice steadier than he felt. The man stopped, his face changing from confusion to something darker. In the distance, Mr. Thompson could hear sirens, but they still sounded too far away. He had to keep the situation under control for just a few more minutes. The man tried to act casual, claiming he was just making his last delivery of the day. But his eyes kept darting around the parking lot, checking the exits. "I've seen inside your van," Mr. Thompson said, his heart racing, but his words clear and strong. "And I'd already called the police. They're on their way." That's when everything happened at once. The man lunged for the driver's door, but Mr. Thompson was faster. He positioned himself between the door and the man, using his solid build to block the way. "You're not leaving with that child," he said, each word filled with determination. The kidnapper's face twisted with anger, and he reached into his pocket. Mr. Thompson's mind flashed back to the self-defense classes he'd taken. Stay calm, control the situation, protect yourself and others. He kept his phone recording while keeping his eyes on the man's hands. The kidnapper pulled out car keys, not a weapon, but Mr. Thompson didn't relax. Years of working with troubled youth had taught him how quickly situations could turn dangerous. The sirens were getting closer now. The man must have heard them too because panic flashed across his face. He tried to shove past Mr. Thompson, but years of playing basketball and keeping in shape paid off. Mr. Thompson held his ground, using his body weight to stay firmly in place. "It's over," he said quietly. "Don't make this worse than it already is." Blue and red lights suddenly filled the parking lot as 3 police cars pulled in, blocking all exits. Officers jumped out with their weapons drawn, shouting commands. Everything happened so fast after that. The kidnapper tried to run, but didn't make it 3 steps before officers tackled him to the ground. While they handcuffed the man, Mr. Thompson rushed to the van's back doors. An officer used a tool to break the lock, and together they pulled the doors open. The boy was there, scared but alive, his eyes squinting at the sudden light. Mr. Thompson felt tears well up in his eyes as he helped the child out, wrapping him in his own jacket. More police cars arrived, along with an ambulance. The boy clung to Mr. Thompson while paramedics checked him over. He wouldn't speak yet, but his grip on Mr. Thompson's hand said everything. Within minutes, the parking lot was full of activity. Officers taking statements, crime scene investigators examining the van, and news vans starting to arrive. Then came the moment that made everything worth it. The boy's parents arrived, their faces streaked with tears of relief. The sound of their reunion, the mother's cry of joy, the father's shaking voice, would stay with Mr. Thompson forever. The boy finally let go of his hand to run into his parents' arms, and Mr. Thompson stepped back, letting the family have their moment. Officers came to take his statement, praising his quick thinking and courage. But Mr. Thompson didn't feel like a hero. He kept thinking about all the other missing children out there, all the parents still waiting for their kids to come home. As he watched the family hugging and crying together, he knew he'd done what any decent person should do. Sometimes being brave just means refusing to look the other way. What he didn't know then was that his actions that evening had stirred up something much bigger. The mysterious black SUV that would soon appear outside his house was just the beginning of a deeper, darker story that was about to unfold. The next morning, Mr. Thompson woke up to find his phone buzzing nonstop with messages and calls. The local news had picked up the story overnight, and his quiet life had suddenly become anything but quiet. His son burst into his bedroom, waving his tablet excitedly. "Dad, you're all over the internet. Everyone at school is talking about it." He tried to go about his normal routine, making breakfast, getting ready for work at the counseling center. But every time he checked his phone, there were more notifications. The local news station wanted an interview. The police department wanted to give him a civilian award. Even the mayor's office had called to commend his bravery. At work, students and teachers kept stopping by his office to congratulate him. Some kids even asked for his autograph, which made him laugh and shake his head. "I'm still just your counselor," he'd tell them, "still here to listen if you need to talk." But he noticed that some of the troubled students who usually avoided his office were now looking at him differently, with a new kind of respect. The boy's parents had sent him a handwritten thank you note that made his eyes water when he read it. They described how their son was slowly recovering, opening up about what happened, and mentioned that the police were discovering connections to other missing children cases. Reading their words, Mr. Thompson felt grateful he trusted his instincts that evening. But not all the attention was positive. Some online comments questioned why he'd been walking in that area, suggesting he might have been involved somehow. Others criticized him for putting himself in danger instead of just calling the police and walking away. A few trolls made racist remarks about his motives, twisting his good deed into something suspicious. His wife worried about all the attention, especially the negative comments. Just ignore them, she'd say, deleting the hate-filled messages from his social media. But it wasn't that easy. As a counselor, he knew how words could affect people, how doubt could creep in and poison even the most straightforward situations. The police had asked him to keep certain details private while they investigated further. They discovered that the kidnapper was part of something bigger, but they couldn't share more information yet. This made some people even more suspicious, leading to wild theories online about what really happened in that parking lot. During lunch break, he overheard two teachers discussing how the whole incident seemed staged for attention. Their words stung, but he remembered what he always told his students: you can't control what others think, only how you respond to it. He kept his head high and focused on his work, helping kids deal with their own struggles. One bright spot came from his counseling center colleagues. They understood why he'd acted as he did, and they supported him completely. You did what we all hope we'd have the courage to do, his supervisor told him, squeezing his shoulder. Don't let anyone make you doubt that. By the end of the week, most of the media attention had died down, but something felt different in his community. Parents would stop him at the grocery store to thank him, not just for saving that one child, but for showing their own kids what it means to stand up for others. Some of his students started a Be Brave club, inspired by his actions, focusing on helping others in their community. Through it all, Mr. Thompson tried to stay grounded. He kept making his famous chili for students who needed a good meal. He continued running his support groups and meeting with troubled teens. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't finished. The story that had made headlines was just the surface of something deeper, and the black SUV that would soon appear outside his house would prove his instincts right once again. 3 days after the rescue, while grading papers on his front porch, Mr. Thompson first noticed the black SUV. It was parked across the street, its engine off but windows too dark to see inside. At first, he didn't think much of it. People often parked along his street when visiting neighbors. But as the sun began to set, something about the vehicle made him uneasy. The next evening, the same SUV appeared again, parking in exactly the same spot. Mr. Thompson was watering his flower beds when he saw it roll up silently, like a shadow settling into place. His neighbor walked by with her dog, waving cheerfully, seemingly unbothered by the mysterious vehicle. But years of working with troubled youth had taught him to trust his gut feelings. He called the local police, describing the vehicle and his concerns. The dispatcher's response was polite but dismissive. "Sir, it's probably just someone visiting the neighborhood. Unless they're breaking the law, there's not much we can do." But Mr. Thompson knew better. The SUV always arrived at sunset and left precisely at 10 p.m., like clockwork. His wife noticed a distraction during dinner. "You're watching that window again," she said softly, putting her hand over his. Their son was busy telling stories about school, but Mr. Thompson's eyes kept drifting to the street outside. The black SUV sat there, its presence like a weight pressing down on their peaceful evening. On the 5th night, he decided to take action. After making sure his family was safely inside, he walked purposefully toward the vehicle. His heart was pounding, but his steps were steady. He'd face down a kidnapper. He could face whatever this was. But as he got within 20 feet, the SUV's engine rumbled to life, and it pulled away smoothly, disappearing around the corner. The next morning, he dropped by the police station on his way to work. The desk sergeant listened to his story, typing notes into his computer. "Look," the sergeant said, "after what you did with that kidnapping case, it's natural to feel paranoid. But unless they're threatening you," he left the sentence hanging, his expression sympathetic but unconvinced. At school, Mr. Thompson tried to focus on his students, but his mind kept wandering to the SUV. During his lunch break, he used his computer to research suspicious vehicles in the area. That's when he found something interesting. Other people had reported similar black SUVs near their homes, but only after they'd been involved in stopping crimes or helping victims. He started documenting everything. The exact times the SUV arrived and left. The way it was always spotlessly clean, despite the recent rain. How it never had the same license plate twice. His wife worried he was becoming obsessed, but she helped him keep track, taking photos from their upstairs window. One of his former students, now working at the local auto shop, mentioned something that made his blood run cold. The type of SUV he described wasn't available to the public. It was a special model, usually reserved for government agencies or private security firms. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was both fascinating and frightening. The rescued boy's parents had mentioned the police were finding connections to other cases. What if this was bigger than just one kidnapping? What if his actions that day had accidentally uncovered something much larger? He thought about the scratches he'd seen on that white van, wondering how many other children had been taken. As he sat on his porch that evening, watching the familiar black SUV take its usual spot, Mr. Thompson felt something shift inside him. He was no longer afraid. Now he was curious. Whatever game this was, whoever was watching him, they clearly wanted something. And after years of helping young people face their fears, he knew that sometimes the only way forward was straight through the mystery. The SUV's window rolled down slightly, and for the first time, he caught a glimpse of movement inside. Tomorrow, he decided, he wouldn't retreat when he approached. Tomorrow, he would get answers. What he didn't know was that those answers would draw him into a world he never imagined existed, right beneath the surface of his ordinary life. Unable to ignore the mystery any longer, Mr. Thompson spent his lunch break in the school library, digging deeper into local news archives. His longtime friend who worked there helped him access old newspaper records. As he scrolled through articles about missing children from the past year, a pattern began to emerge that made his stomach turn. Every few months, a child would disappear, only to be found days later in a different part of the city. The kids were always returned physically unharmed but deeply traumatized. Police had treated each case separately, but looking at them together, Mr. Thompson noticed similarities. White delivery vans, children taken during routine walks, and most interestingly, witnesses reporting black SUVs in their neighborhoods before each incident. His research was interrupted by a text from one of his former students who now worked at the vehicle registration office. "That plate number you asked about. It's registered to a company that doesn't exist. I double-checked. The address leads to an empty lot outside the city." Taking a deep breath, Mr. Thompson opened his laptop and started a document, typing everything he'd learned. The kidnapper he'd caught wasn't working alone. That much was clear. But why were these children being taken and then returned? And why was someone watching him now? His counseling background told him that understanding patterns was key to solving problems. During his afternoon session with troubled teens, one of the kids mentioned something that caught his attention. "My cousin was taken last year," the boy said quietly. When he came back, he wouldn't talk about what happened. But he drew pictures, lots of pictures, all with the same symbol. Mr. Thompson's heart raced as the boy described a logo that matched a faded marking he'd seen on the kidnapper's van. After school, he drove to the police station, asking to speak with Detective Brown, who'd handled the rescued boy's case. The detective's office was cluttered with files and coffee cups, but his eyes were sharp as Mr. Thompson shared his findings. "We've been working on something similar," the detective admitted, pulling out a thick folder. "But we needed someone to make the connection." Together, they spread out photos and reports on the detective's desk. Each case had seemed isolated, but viewed together, they painted a disturbing picture. The trafficking ring wasn't just operating in their city, it had connections across the state. And the black SUVs, they appeared wherever someone got too close to uncovering the truth. Mr. Thompson's hands shook as he realized what he'd stumbled into. His simple act of courage in that parking lot had unknowingly threatened a criminal operation years in the making. The detective showed him surveillance photos of known members, but the leaders remained mysterious, hiding behind shell companies and fake identities. Using his counseling skills, Mr. Thompson helped piece together information from the recovered children's therapy sessions. The kids' descriptions, though fragmented, suggested the traffickers were part of a larger organization, one that had infiltrated legitimate businesses as cover for their operations. As the sun began to set, Mr. Thompson's phone buzzed. His wife had sent a photo. The black SUV was back, but this time it wasn't alone. A second vehicle had joined it, parked further down the street. His heart pounded as Detective Brown looked at the image. "You're not just being paranoid," the detective said grimly. "They're watching you because you're getting close to something." Walking to his car that evening, Mr. Thompson felt the weight of his discoveries pressing down on him. He wanted to help one child, but now he was caught up in something much bigger. The traffickers were organized, careful, and clearly well-funded. But they'd made one mistake. They'd underestimated a high school counselor's determination to protect children. As he drove home, constantly checking his rearview mirror, Mr. Thompson knew he had a choice to make. He could back away, return to his normal life, and pretend he hadn't seen the pattern. Or he could step forward, using his skills and experience to help bring down an organization that preyed on innocent children. Deep down, he already knew which choice he would make. The evening sky had turned deep purple when Mr. Thompson pulled into his driveway. The black SUV was there as usual, but something felt different tonight. Instead of feeling threatened, he felt ready. As he stepped out of his car, the SUV's door opened for the first time in days. A woman in a crisp business suit emerged, her badge catching the last light of day. "Mr. Thompson," she called out, her voice professional but warm. "I think it's time we talked." She introduced herself as a senior FBI agent, showing credentials that proved she was exactly who she claimed to be. His wife watched from the window as they sat on the porch steps. The agent explained that the Bureau had been tracking the trafficking ring for 3 years. They'd built a solid case, gathering evidence piece by piece, following money trails and surveillance footage. But they'd hit a wall, until Mr. Thompson's intervention changed everything. "When you saved that boy," the agent explained, "you didn't just stop one kidnapping. You gave us our first real break in the case." She pulled out a tablet, showing him photographs of warehouses, shipping manifests, and bank records. The white van he encountered was just one piece of a massive operation spanning several states. The agent's words confirmed everything he discovered, but with deeper implications. The trafficking ring had connections to powerful people: business owners, politicians, even law enforcement. That's why the FBI had to move carefully, building an airtight case before making any moves. "We've been watching you," she admitted, "but not to threaten you. We needed to make sure you were trustworthy." She explained how they'd investigated his background, his work at the school, his history of helping troubled youth. "We need your help, Mr. Thompson. Your experience with traumatized children could be invaluable." Inside the house, his wife had moved closer to the door, listening. His son was at a friend's house, thankfully missing this conversation that would change their lives. Mr. Thompson thought about all the children still in danger, all the families waiting for answers. The agent outlined their proposal. They wanted him to work as a civilian consultant, using his counseling skills to help interview rescued children. His experience building trust with troubled youth could help gather crucial information while protecting the children's emotional well-being. "It's dangerous," the agent said honestly. "These people have resources and connections. We can protect you and your family, but you need to understand what you're getting into." She showed him one last photo, surveillance footage of other white vans, identical to the one he'd encountered, moving children across state lines. Mr. Thompson looked at his wife through the window, seeing the concern in her eyes. 20 years of counseling had taught him to read people, to understand their fears and hopes. His wife nodded slightly. She knew him well enough to know he couldn't walk away from this. The children we rescue, the agent continued, they trust you already. Word has spread about what you did. That kind of trust is something we can't build overnight. She explained how other rescued kids had asked to speak with the brave counselor who saved one of their friends. Standing up, Mr. Thompson looked at the second black SUV down the street. Those other agents, he said, they've been protecting my family. The agent nodded. We had to be sure the trafficking ring wasn't targeting you for revenge. Now we know they are, which makes your decision even more important. The porch light came on automatically, reminding him of how late it had grown. His decision would affect not just him, but his family, his students, and countless children he'd never met. The agent waited patiently, understanding the weight of the moment. Looking at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, Mr. Thompson thought about all the parents out there, waiting for someone to bring their children home. He turned to the agent, his voice steady and clear. Tell me what you need me to do. The next morning, Mr. Thompson walked into a nondescript office building on the outskirts of town. Behind its plain exterior lay a bustling FBI command center. Agents moved purposefully between desks covered with maps, photographs, and stacks of files. Several nodded at him with respect. They'd clearly been briefed about his role. The senior agent led him to a small, comfortable room designed to feel welcoming. Soft chairs, warm lighting, and colorful artwork made it feel more like a counseling office than a federal building. This is where you'll talk to the children, she explained. We want them to feel safe here. His first interview was with a 12-year-old girl who'd been rescued the previous week. She sat quietly, clutching a stuffed bear, eyes down. Mr. Thompson drew from his years of experience, starting not with questions, but with simple conversation about her favorite subjects in school. Slowly, her shoulders relaxed. I heard you helped my friend, she said suddenly, looking up. He told me you weren't scary like the others. This was why the FBI needed him. The children trusted him instinctively. Over the next hour, through gentle conversation and drawing exercises, she revealed crucial details about where she'd been held. The work was emotionally draining. Each child's story added another piece to the puzzle, but hearing their experiences took its toll. At lunch, sitting alone in the break room, Mr. Thompson felt the weight of what he'd learned. An agent noticed and sat down across from him. It's okay to take breaks, she said kindly. This isn't easy for any of us. Back at school, he maintained his regular counseling duties. His students noticed he seemed more tired than usual, but his dedication never wavered. If anything, his work with the FBI made him even more attentive to signs that a student might be struggling or in danger. The trafficking ring's patterns became clearer with each interview. The children described similar locations, routines, and faces. Mr. Thompson worked with sketch artists, helping the kids feel comfortable enough to describe what they remembered. His ability to build trust proved invaluable. One evening, reviewing notes from the day's interviews, he noticed something that had slipped past others. Several children mentioned a distinctive sound, machinery running late at night. Combined with their descriptions of the buildings and the smell of clean chemicals, it pointed to a specific type of industrial facility. The FBI team moved quickly on this information. Surveillance teams identified several potential locations matching the descriptions. Mr. Thompson's insights helped them narrow down which ones were most likely being used by the traffickers. His experience with troubled youth had taught him to notice patterns others might miss. Working late one night, he received an urgent call. A raid on one of the locations had rescued 3 more children. Would he come help? Without hesitation, he drove to the scene. The children, frightened and confused, responded to his calm presence. One small boy grabbed his hand and wouldn't let go for hours. The emotional toll of the work affected his home life. Some nights, he'd wake up from nightmares about the children he couldn't yet help. His wife would hold him. listening as he shared what he could about his day. Their son noticed the change in his father, but was proud when he overheard other kids at school talking about how Mr. Thompson was helping people. Despite the challenges, seeing the reunited families made everything worth it. Each successful rescue brought new intelligence, leading them closer to the organization's leaders. The FBI's case was growing stronger, built on the foundation of trust Mr. Thompson established with the rescued children. One child's drawing particularly stuck with him: a bright sun breaking through dark clouds. When he asked about it, the young artist said simply, "That's how it felt when you helped us." Those words reminded him why he'd chosen this path, despite its difficulties. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't the rescue itself, but the quiet determination to keep going, day after day, until justice is served. 6 months after that first encounter with a mysterious van, Mr. Thompson stood in the back of a crowded press conference. The FBI announced the successful dismantling of one of the largest trafficking rings in the state's history. 12 children had been rescued, 38 arrests made, and millions in criminal assets seized. Nobody mentioned his name during the official announcement. That's how he wanted it. He watched from the shadows as the FBI director detailed the operation's success, thinking about all the quiet moments that had led to this day, the late-night interviews, the tearful breakthroughs, the small victories that built trust one child at a time. After the press conference, he drove to the community center where it had all started. The parking lot looked different now, just an ordinary space with cars coming and going. A mother and daughter walked past, laughing about something. They had no idea that right here, half a year ago, one man's decision to stop and listen had started a chain reaction. Back at school, life was slowly returning to normal. The black SUVs no longer appeared outside his house. His son had stopped checking the news every morning for updates about his dad. But things weren't exactly the same. They never would be. His students noticed he listened even more carefully now, especially when something seemed off in their lives. The FBI had offered him a full-time position, but he turned it down. "I'm a counselor," he told them simply. "This is where I'm needed." Instead, he started a support group for families affected by trafficking. Every Thursday evening, parents gathered in his office, sharing stories, fears, and hopes. Their strength amazed him. One afternoon, a small package arrived at his office. Inside was a handmade card signed by all the rescued children. Their drawings and messages brought tears to his eyes. One child had written, "Thank you for hearing us when nobody else would listen." Another drew a picture of a superhero wearing a counselor's badge instead of a cape. His wife organized a small celebration dinner at home. Close friends, family, and a few trusted colleagues gathered to mark the end of this chapter. The senior FBI agent came too, bringing news that the case had led to investigations in other states. What started in their small community had grown into something much larger. During dinner, his son asked him if he was scared that night in the parking lot. Mr. Thompson thought carefully before answering. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," he explained. "It means you do what's right even when you are scared." The table fell quiet, everyone reflecting on those words. The following week, he started implementing new safety awareness programs in schools across the district. His experience had taught him that prevention was just as important as rescue. He trained teachers to spot warning signs and taught students about trust and personal safety without spreading fear. Some of the rescued children still came to see him for counseling. Their recovery would take time, but each small step forward filled him with hope. One girl, who hadn't spoken for weeks after her rescue, now helped younger kids in his peer support program. "You showed me that one person can make a difference," she told him. "Now I want to do the same." As he sat in his office on a quiet Friday afternoon, Mr. Thompson looked at the wall where he'd hung that first thank you card from the boy he'd saved. Next to it were photos of smiling families reunited, letters of gratitude, and children's drawings full of hope. Each one represented not just a rescue, but a reminder that ordinary people could do extraordinary things. The sun was setting as he packed up to go home, casting long shadows across his desk. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students needing help, new battles to fight. But tonight, he would go home to his family, grateful for the simple things: a warm dinner, a safe home, and the knowledge that somewhere out there, children were sleeping peacefully because one person chose to stop and listen.